Hi, this is Christiana Hale, author of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy. You're listening to Pints with Jack.
I think the libretto is just stunningly good. It brought tears to my eyes in places. It will be terrific. I very heartily congratulate you. This is Pints with Jack, Season 6, Episode 30, Perelandra, the Opera. After Hours with Professor Judith Wolfe and John Marr. Welcome everyone. Here on Pints with Jack, we are reading our way through the works of C.S. Lewis. And this season, we read through Out of the Silent Planet, and we will be getting to its sequel, Perelandra, in the not-too-distant future. But I thought it would be a good time to have an episode on Perelandra. Not the book, but the opera. And that's what's being described in today's opening quotation, which comes from a letter written by C.S. Lewis. Now, I first discovered the existence of Perelandra the opera when I was in Oxford a few years ago. I was visiting the Oxford Oratory with my then girlfriend, Marie, and we were looking through their G.K. Chesterton collection, since at the time they had all of his books and many of his personal effects. But in the library, there were a few boxes in the corner, and I wandered over to them and started looking through them. And in one of them, I came across a flyer for the opera. And I was curious and I asked a couple of people about it, but I didn't do much more. But then last season, Dr. Don W. King mentioned it again, and that set me on a journey to find out more. And so in today's episode, we're going to find out more about this opera. We're going to look at its history, the different productions of it, and we're also going to listen to some of its music and discuss it. And in order to do this, I'm going to need not just one, but two guests, Judith Wolfe and John Marr. So, first of all, Professor Judith Wolfe, she holds a BA in English Literature and Interdisciplinary Honours Studies from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, an MPhil in English Literature, MA in Theology, and a DPhil in Theology, all from Oxford. She has been a member of the School of Divinity at St Andrews University since 2014, and has intimate involvement in a production of Perelandra the opera. Professor Judith Wolfe, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as I said, I don't just have one guest today, but two. And my second is Professor John Marr. John is a music professor at Santa Ana College in California, but he's also a listener, a longtime patron supporter, and a member of the C.S. Lewis reading group, which I used to run in San Diego.
Well, and I certainly miss my favorite Englishman being so close to me. So yes, Wisconsin's not quite as accessible for me.
Yeah. Well, since Professor Wolfe teaches at the University of St Andrews in Scotland, and it's rather early here in La Crosse, Wisconsin, today I have poured myself a very strong cup of Scottish breakfast tea. What are you two drinking?
I'm drinking coffee, dully. It's still before 5 o'clock, even here in Scotland. But one of my 4 younger brothers is a Carmelite monk in the wilderness of the Rocky Mountains, where they produce a coffee called Mystic Monk Coffee. And he supplies me when I go and visit him in the Rockies.
How about you, John?
Well, thanks to you, I learned that C.S. Lewis drank Thai food tea, so I'm having a nice cup of Thai food tea because it is very early here in Southern California.
Excellent choice. And yes, thank you for getting up at the crack of dawn. Cheers.
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 Okay, so listeners, this is how I'm hoping today's episode is going to go. We're going to divide it into 2 parts, and in the first part, John and I are going to ask Professor Wolfe questions about Perelandra the opera, its history, the various productions that have been put on. And then in the second part, John is going to be in the driver's seat, because there we're going to talk more specifically about the music itself. But before we get to that, I first came across Professor Wolfe's work quite some time ago when I picked up a copy of C.S. Lewis and the Church, which was a collection of essays she co-edited and which were presented to Walter Hooper. So, Professor Wolfe, before we start talking about Perelandra the opera, what's your own history with the Inklings, Lewis, and Perelandra the book?
That's a good question. I think like most young people, I encountered Lewis sometime during my childhood or early teenage years and was enthralled by him. But it took me until I studied theology in Oxford to realize that he wasn't simply saying what every sane Christian would say, that he had a distinctive voice, that he had a distinctive theological vision. And I think it was then that I became interested in trying to work out more academically what that consisted in, what its implications were, what its presuppositions were, and started working on Lewis in the context mainly of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society as an academic subject, which, of course, as you know, in Oxford is entirely beyond the pale. He is not a subject of polite conversation in the senior common rooms, but we created a group of people and a conversation around him that has since expanded, I think, even in Oxford. And it's good to see that he's being treated, of course, by people like Rowan Williams or Alistair McGrath.
Okay, and how did you first discover this operatic version of Perelandra?
Gosh, so this was when I was secretary of the C.S. Lewis Society in Oxford, and we were looking for speakers, and we had heard vaguely that there was this opera. And so the president, Brendan Wolfe, who later became my husband, and I contacted the executor of Donald Swan's estate, Leon Berger, and asked him whether he knew anything about this and whether he could come and talk to us about it. And he said not only did he know about it, Swan had sat with him more or less on Swan's deathbed, explaining what had become a cut-up version of a handwritten score and libretto, which he hoped somebody would put back together at some point. And I can tell you more about why it was all cut up in a little while. But he came and talked to us about it, and he played a few excerpts which had been recorded all the way back in 1963 by an amateur around Donald Swan's piano. And several of us had tears in our eyes from one of the songs, which is called No Man Can Shorten the Way. And we said, we have to do this. And so we ended up taking a year or more to reconstruct what by then had really been a disfigured series of, or a collection of fragments in Donald Swan's attic, and built it back together and did the performances.
Wow. Well, can we rewind the clock, and can you tell us how this opera came to be in the first place? And actually, I should note, listeners, we're going to be talking about Perelandra the opera, so there may well be spoilers for Perelandra the book ahead. So if you haven't read it and you care about spoilers, go read that book and then return to this podcast. But with that said, Professor Wolfe, how did this opera come to be? And also, what was Lewis's involvement with it?
All right, so the opera came about. I don't know how familiar people in other countries are with the comic musical duo Flanders and Swan, who were very famous, very successful in the UK in the post-war years, 1950s, 1960s. They were fabulously funny. And Donald Swan was the composer and pianist of the duo. Michael Flanders was the singer and possibly librettist. And in their success as a comic duo, Donald Swan, the composer and pianist, felt increasingly that he really enjoyed this, but also wanted to make it in the serious music world. And he decided to write an opera. And he had been reading C.S. Lewis's Perelandra and thought this would be a magnificent subject for an opera. And he wrote to an old chum of his, David Marsh, a librettist, and said, hey, do you want to do this? We'll have to get permission from the old Maleldil, of course, but, worth trying. And Marsh was very enthusiastic. So they wrote to Lewis, and we then have a letter from Swan to Marsh saying the old Maleldil was indeed keen. And so they set out on this with Lewis's enthusiastic support, as you saw from the letter that he wrote later on. It was an interesting collaboration because Marsh in particular was a pacifist and had real trouble with Lewis's depiction of Ransom killing somebody. And if you listen to the opera, you'll see that part is treated quite interestingly. But they kept meeting with Lewis, discussing the libretto, discussing the ideas. Lewis came to them once with his own little bit of libretto, a sort of dialogue for the Lady and the King, which they had to reject in the end. But Swan said, we couldn't fit it in. I couldn't get used to his style. It was too awkward. He was rather fed up with that. In fact, I think he would have liked to write his own libretto. And that's really interesting, of course, because actually, as we know, Lewis started Perelandra as a narrative poetry. We have an early fragment, which is, I think, the earliest bit of the novel, what became the novel Perelandra in poetic form, which goes like this: the floating islands, the flat golden sky, at noon, the peacock sunset, tepid waves, with the land sliding over them like a skin, the alien Eve, green-bodied, stepping forth to meet my hero from her forest home, proud, courteous, unafraid, no thought infirm alters her cheek. You can see that this doesn't lend itself very well to a libretto, but you can also see how Lewis would have been excited. And so they finished the opera. They performed it around Swan's piano in 1963, just before Lewis's death. Lewis was enthusiastic and they thought that they had a hit on their hands. And so Donald Swan then financed 3 concert performances in Oxford and Cambridge and in London in 1964, which received mixed reviews. And he considered cutting it a little. It was over 3 hours long. The reviews were mixed because he was very much in the old sort of melodic vein, rather than being atonal and progressive. Except when it came to Weston, actually, the character of Weston gets all this atonal stuff. It then turned out a few years later that Curtis Marsh, Lewis's agent, had sold the performance rights to the novel to Hollywood.
No.
And Lewis had not been savvy enough in copyright issues to exclude the libretto and the opera version of Perelandra from the general rights to the novel. And therefore, for the rest of Swan's life, his own opera was embargoed. Oof. Because Hollywood had the performance rights and he just couldn't get it performed. And that's why he cut up the handwritten score in an attempt to get excerpts of it performed, because he couldn't get the whole thing performed. And so when he died, there was this stack of papers in his attic, all cut up, and he was sitting with the person who became the executor of his estate, trying to explain to him how these would be put back together in order to have the whole thing again. So in the end, when we performed it, we hadn't actually managed to get everything back together, but the musicians played with these taped up scores on their podiums. And the reason that we were able to do that was that by that time, although Swan was long dead, the rights had also lapsed. Hollywood hadn't made use of them. And so it was now, again, performable, but everybody had forgotten about it.
Well, one of the questions that I'm sure a lot of listeners are going to be asking themselves at the end of this episode is it possible to listen to this opera today?
Yes and no. We staged 2 concert performances in Oxford, one at Keble College Chapel and one at the Sheldonian Theatre. And a poet, and indeed the last graduate student of C.S. Lewis's, funded a professional recording of it. So a professional recording exists. However, the Swan estate and the Marsh estate have not given permission for it to be distributed commercially. And so we have a limited edition of, I think, about 30 CDs, which we are allowed to give to people for research purposes, but which we're not allowed to sell.
Oh my goodness. Okay. And I'm a very happy recipient of one of those copies. So thank you so much, David. All right. And you've covered a lot of this before, but is there anything else you can tell us about Swan's inspiration to compose the opera? And I do agree, it is a good, out of Lewis's works, it's a very good one to set to opera, because there's not a lot of action that happens. And most operas have relatively short narratives, so to speak.
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, it's very interesting that on the one hand, Lewis says somewhere, I think in a conversation with Kingsley Amis, that this is the most operatic of his novels. And so absolutely, especially in the final great dance, you can just see that done operatically with multiple voices and so forth. And yet on the other hand, actually, Swan's and Marsh's opera doesn't really make use of that element. It doesn't have that final chorus in it. It's quite different in tone in many ways. So that is an odd thing, but it is certainly, it certainly lends itself to operatic treatment, and particularly to a sort of crossover between, on the one hand, sort of comic opera buffa in the first bits with Lewis and Hayward, and then rising to a much more epic pitch later on. I think Swan wanted to write it. Actually, I have a quote from him here. Let me read this to you. He gives a very strong rationale. He says, Perelandra contains one of Lewis's searching portrayals of paradise, of the true world that he felt in his bones was ours, but from which we had been disinherited, not only mythically through Adam, but daily through each one of us. I wrote the work under the spell of it, and with the conviction that if we did not have a glimpse of paradise, we are living without a limb, without an eye, without a sense, whichever metaphor you care to choose.
That's wonderful.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
That's lovely. And then I think you've already answered this, but I just wanted to reiterate from what I understand from what you said earlier. C.S. Lewis would actually have heard part of this on piano, performed by Swan. Is that correct? Did he ever see any staged portion of this, or has this opera ever been staged? Because you mentioned concert performances in England back in the 60s, and I know it was performed in New York.
So Swan wrote a piano score. He then commissioned an orchestration from Max Saunders, who was a longtime collaborator, who wrote an orchestration for a 35-piece opera, which was then used with professional singers at the Guildhall in Cambridge, the Oxford Town Hall, and the Mermaid Theatre in London for 3 performances in 1964. Staging would have been prohibitively expensive, so it wasn't staged at that time. In 1969, Swan tried, in an attempt to make this into a sort of quasi-oratorio that wasn't closely enough based on Perelandra to come under the copyright issues. He did a much shortened version with students from Bryn Mawr College in Haverford, which was staged. And we have some pictures from that staging. And they're very odd because, as you can imagine, the characters are meant to be nude. So they are wearing these strange full-body suits in green, which really don't look... I mean, they look quite distracting in a sort of... I don't know. I'm not sure that it really gained much by the staging, and I'm not sure that Swan ever really thought through the implications of staging this.
All right, and I believe that actually answers my next question, and I was going to actually ask that if they did stage it, how the staging, blocking, costuming, etc. Because it wouldn't be the first opera with nudity, because there actually are there are a few operas that do have nudity, and sometimes nudity is actually added in, but it can be a bit of a dodgy prospect, but it sounds like that was kind of their solution, were these kind of green spandex,
leotards,
perhaps.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, understood. Okay, and then now I've heard the 2009 performance that David graciously sent me. Is that version? There's quite a bit of narration. Was that originally part of the opera, or was it added in because it wasn't staged? Because a lot of the narration would be superfluous, like he says, they fight, which, if we were watching it, we would say, okay, these guys are going at it hammer and tongs.
Absolutely. Well, it's actually even more radical than that. So the 2009 version was about, 2 hours long, 2 and a bit. The original opera is 3 hours. And as I say, we haven't actually reconstructed the entire thing. So there are still bits and pieces of scoring on fragments that have not been reincorporated, partly because it would have been prohibitively long and expensive and we were on the timeline. And so actually the narrations are the bits where there would be more music and sometimes more singing, which are not there at the moment. So there's a challenge for the future.
You mentioned that the players played with taped together scores. Was there any attempt to actually put this into a notation software like Finale or Sibelius? I'm just curious because that would have been available in 2009 and it's relatively easy to do now.
Yep. So we have the singing score for the choir in Sibelius, but not the full orchestral score.
Okay. All right. Well, if you need help and if I have a lot of time.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you.
And you kind of already answered this earlier, but my biggest question, because I listened to the opera and of course I have my own opinions of it, and I it would have been different had I composed it, of course. But regarding Marsh's libretto, do we know why the most libretto portion, the Blessed Be He adulations near the end, were not included? But you may have answered this with C.S. Lewis's attempt at the libretto.
Yes, so 2 things. One, they made it a point of honor in the end not to include any actual lines lifted directly from the novel. That just became a thing. Secondly, Marsh was not a Christian, and he interpreted the entire thing in a more humanist, pacifist way. And so he, I don't think, felt very close to that concluding chorus, which is a great shame for us, obviously. I mean, it would have been great. And so I think, that is really where the opera loses most, is in those passages that are so important to Lewis that Marsh simply doesn't have any spiritual connection to. On the other hand, I must say that what I regard as the best portion of the opera, which is the Maleldil coming and speaking to Ransom before he kills Weston, with this really haunting treble song, No Man May Shorten the Way. That's entirely Marsh. and that is exquisite, I think.
Agreed. Yes, because when I first read Perelandra, I thought, oh, this would be wonderful to set to music there. And whom should interested opera companies, schools, churches, etc. contact if they want to stage the opera? I've written the Swan Estate asking about the libretto and the score, and I never heard back, and I'm happy to pay for both.
Well, it is the Swan Estate who would have to be contacted. I think they are deliberately not very responsive, and so probably going through, well, me really. I mean, I'm the one who dealt with them originally. Would probably be the best. I would be very, very keen for the opera to be revitalized. I think it's a mixed piece of work, but part of it is a wonderful piece of work. And I think if the funding can be found, there would be no real impediment.
Right. And that's the thing too. And it's interesting what you said about, when the opera was composed and whatnot there, because the thing is, you're correct. That style of music was considered very old fashioned at the time, and it would not really where music was. But then, when David contacted me, I just went through the Wikipedia article on operas in the 60s because I really can't think of any. And the next one after that that's really big would be Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass, which was written in 76. But the thing is that out of all the operas I read about written and composed in the 60s, one, maybe two are ever performed. So, and I think this is just as good as, those other two. So,
yeah, I agree.
I'm curious, do you guys know of any other musical adaptations which have been attempted based on Lewis's works? I'm aware of a musical version of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Friend of the show, Brittany White, she's been involved with one production of that at least. And actually, I was in Chicago with my wife this past month to watch Bareface, which is a ballet adaptation of Till We Have Faces. And actually, I think that episode is going to release just before this one. But at the time, I remember thinking, you know what? This would be a fantastic opera.
Well, I've attempted, and I'm still sort of half attempting a theatrical version of Till We Have Faces, but not a musical one. But I think it's a remarkably theatrical book as well, and would be really wonderful on stage. And I'd love to see the balletic version. That sounds fascinating. Donald Swan wrote Tolkien songs as well. I mean, to Tolkien fans, Donald Swan is best known for his lead versions of some of Tolkien's poems, particularly Bilbo's Last Song. But I don't think that he put any of Lewis's poems to music. One of Lewis's poems was, of course, put to music by Paul Miller, for the royal wedding a few years ago. Love's Warmest Tears, is that right?
Mm-hmm. And the other one I can think of is Phil Keaggy, who's done As the Ruin Falls.
Oh, yes, of course. That's right. But nothing larger scale that I can think of. John, do you know of anything?
Well, actually, I'm trying to chase something down here on the West Coast. So I've studied a type of musical training called ORF, ORFF, but it's just kind of a way of teaching music as a general subject rather than a pull-out. I was in Vegas at a conference back in 2002. And I saw in the newspaper there was an oratorio composed for the Screwtape Letters, and so I'm trying to chase that down right now. The composer is Carol H. Blanton, and I've contacted somebody in the College of Southern Nevada, and I'm still trying to chase that down. I know she's still around. The director has since retired. It was produced at that college, so I'm trying to find that because I really would like to see if they're again like a score excerpt, anything. And it's one of those great regrets because at the time I didn't see it when I was in Vegas because my children were with me and they were very, very young at the time, and I just couldn't leave them, with their mother. But that would be that's the one I'm trying to chase down right now. I think it'd be fun to find that.
Oh, do let me know if you find it. I'd be interested.
Of course.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like to say about the history of this production before we move into part 2 and listen to some of the music and have a chat about it?
No, I can't think of anything else. To some extent, this really came about haphazardly. If we hadn't heard that very poorly recorded excerpt at a C.S. Lewis Society meeting, we would not have ventured down that long journey. And had I not just had a baby boy we would have not have done it either. And so in a sense, the fact that it came about is really wonderful, but also has clear limitations imposed by those conditions. I hadn't produced anything on that scale before. My co-producer, who, as I say, later became my husband, hadn't either. And we had the great advantage of being in Oxford, where there were professional orchestras that could be hired. We had the great advantage of Donald Swan's executor and a conductor from London who had worked closely with Donald Swan being on board and being able to source professional singers from the London area. And we had the advantage of a musical director from Magdalen College being willing to train the choir. But really it was very much, a ragbag of talent and enthusiasm and willingness that brought about these two wonderful, but nevertheless quite limited performances. And it would be wonderful if this could blossom into something larger that did more justice to the work that it is.
So thus far, we've spoken about the history of the operatic adaptation of Perelandra. Now it's time to dive into the music itself. And since I know relatively little about opera, I thought I'd kick things off with a quotation from Lewis, which comes from a letter which he wrote in March of 1956 to Mrs. R.E. Halverson. One must first distinguish the effect which music has on people like me, who are musically illiterate, and get only the emotional effect, and that which it has on real musical scholars, who perceive the structure and get an intellectual satisfaction as well. And so while I have attended a few operas, I think it's safe to say that I am very much a novice when it comes to this stuff. So I'm pretty much going to be handing it over to you two for most of the rest of the episode. But I did think that we should begin with a novice question about this genre of music. So I actually have two questions. What is opera? And why do people like it?
Well, you're lucky to have in the room representatives of both of Lewis's types. I'm the musically illiterate person who only gets emotional enjoyment out of opera, and John is the literate person who also gets intellectual satisfaction.
Too kind.
So I'll make a quick start, and then I'll hand over to John. Opera is essentially the longer-standing and more respectable cousin of musical theatre. It's happened for a long time and therefore has important canons, both of how it's done and of the works that are performed. But essentially, opera is musical theatre that's performed through composed. So they sing all the time with an orchestra without any amplification, which means that the voices of opera singers have to be very strong, which is how you get the famous sort of vibrato that you hear in their voices. But opera tells stories of any scale, from the very intimate to the very grand and public and epic. And it kind of, in a way like a novel, breaks down the barrier between inside and outside, between the external and the internal. It allows emotions to be expressed publicly, and to be expressed in music in such a way that the communication or the expression of the emotion is in a way also their fulfillment, especially expressions of desire or fear or love in music are done in such a way that the audience gets caught up in them. This is really the sort of emotional impact that Lewis is describing. So you're in this world, you find yourself surrounded by this world where emotion is radiant and public and alive, and you can be drawn into it. And there's really no experience like it. I found opera when I was, I think, 4 years old. I heard the Magic Flute for the first time and I got hooked on it. And I've loved it ever since, I suppose. I graduated from Mozart to the Italians and then to Wagner. And these operas create whole worlds that you can get to know. But then once you know them, you sort of inhabit them and you get to explore them again and again through different productions.
That's a wonderful answer. Okay, now that is very hard to follow up there, Judith. But I would add from a historical perspective, yes, it's interesting because it is the oldest continuous art form, and it started in 1600 with Jacopo Peri's setting Eurydice. We had the first masterpiece in 1609 with Monteverdi's L'Orfeo, the Orpheus myth, and it's been going strong ever since. And I'm going to actually steal this from Robert Greenberg, who's great courses, are quite good. And let me just say, my Music 101 classes have gotten a lot better since I've started listening, stealing from him. But he says a opera, and I would change it maybe one word. He goes, a drama. It could be a comedy. It could be a farce. As Judith said, it could be any kind of story, which combines soliloquy, dialogue, scenery, and action, and continuous or nearly continuous music, the whole always greater than the parts. And I love what she said, that it is an entire world. And the what he alludes it to, and what I do think is correct, he alludes it to like television. In the early days, especially for that 17th century in Italy, it was huge. It was everywhere. Not all of, like television, there's not a lot of it that's great. That was great. Even now, there's not a lot of it that has really made its way into the canon. The interesting thing about that, what she said about emotion, is right on the money. And what I love about opera is, for the first time in the history of Western music, you are getting internalized first person, this is how I feel. Prior to that, Western music did not address that. The wonderful stuff from the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, rarely was that in a drama. You wouldn't have this first person point of view outside of like courtly music. But with opera, you get these, big worlds, and there are different kinds of opera. And people always say, "Oh, I don't like it." Well, why? Well, I saw a TikTok, and that's not opera. I mean, you need to actually get into the theater with the musicians and experience it, and that is opera. I've known about it. I mean, I've known bits and pieces, but my parents weren't really into it, so I started attending it in my 20s, and I just love it now. Why do we like it? Because, like I said, it's that first person point of view that we can really get behind. So, like when Orpheus, tells I'm going to defy the gods and everyone else to go down and rescue my Eurydice, we can relate to that. And also, I did want to say that there are all sorts of operas. So, for instance, I had the same thought. So when my children were born, I thought, well, okay, it'd be cool to take them to opera, but you're not going to, getting them to sit through the 4.5 hours of sex, that is Tristan and Isolde by Wagner, maybe not the best idea at first. So the first opera I took my children to was by one of your countrymen there, David. Have you heard of Gavin Bryars? It's an excellent, a wonderful modern composer. He wrote a work, and I don't believe it's been released anywhere, called The Paper Nautilus. And it was performed at the Long Beach Aquarium. And it's non-narrative, and it's kind of these tableaus for a kind of a chamber orchestra with I think a couple pianos and some strings, a little bit of percussion, and some video projection. And they loved it. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And it was interesting to take my kids to this, and they really liked it. I took my youngest to go see, and another composer. Have you heard of Michael Nyman by any chance? Have you seen or Gattaca or The Piano? He did the soundtrack.
I've seen both of those.
He's done the soundtracks to those.
Yes. No, now I remember the name.
Yeah, I do believe Nyman is. Nyman is very underrated in my opinion. But we saw The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat, which was based upon. He was a neurologist by the name of Oliver Sacks. He was treating a professor with musical aphasia, and basically all his logical, the mathematical facilities, he maintained them, but like he couldn't recognize faces anymore. He couldn't tell you what a glove was anymore. He would say, "Oh, you hand him a glove." He goes, "I see a continuous membrane with 5 distinct chambers." And I asked. And I said, "Well, what'd you think of the opera?" And he's all like, "Oh, I felt so bad when his wife realized, he didn't recognize her anymore." So I think opera just hits us. And it's odd because I've taken my kids to actually see most of the modern operas. So they haven't seen Mozart or, Puccini or Wagner, but they've seen a bunch by Philip Glass. We've seen a bunch by, Gavin Bryars or John Adams. So I think it just hits us. And it is the oldest continuous art form that's still relevant today.
It was funny. I was actually talking to my wife just the other day, saying that I want to start assembling the classic canon of Bugs Bunny and Tom and Jerry cartoons, specifically because that was how I received most of my classical music formation, from Tom and Jerry playing at a piano together, or at least the mouse sleeping on the piano and constantly being disrupted. And I think the first opera music I ever heard was when it was sung by Bugs Bunny. It was The Flight of the Valkyries.
Actually, that was sung by Elmer Fudd. Kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit. And I have the same classical training that you do. And that was the thing about like being our age, is you kind of grow up with these tunes in your head, and you learn, oh, hey, that's Liszt, or hey, that's Wagner or Bach. I don't know, Judith, did your parents raise you right and like watch some Bugs Bunny cartoons with a lot of classical music?
I grew up in Vienna, so that wasn't really part of our canon.
Warum nicht? Okay.
Well, okay, so now we've established what opera is, why it's great. What parts of the Perelandra opera would you like to talk about? I've got a few of the public domain clips ready to go. I've got the Birdsong, No Man May Shorten, and the Overture.
Now I do have a question. Because I know you reconstructed the opera or you had a big hand in it. Because you have kind of this prelude, and then you have the overture. Usually the overture is the first thing that happens. So my question is, why did you decide to leave this in? And was there like a postlude? Was there an anchoring kind of, I know it's not in the book, but was there like a postlude that bookends the story on Earth?
So that's a really good question. So as I was saying before, Swan wanted to make it in the serious music world, and this was his ticket in. He expected that this would become part of the serious music canon in Britain, that it would be performed all the time. But he was known, of course, for his comic writing, his comic music. And so he decided initially to have this prelude, this opening scene, which is a kind of comic frame for an opera that's very much not comic. So the opera, very much a romantic piece of music, folklore, traditional piece of music. But the opening scene is the Doctor and C.S. Lewis coming into the cottage waiting for Ransom's arrival back from Perelandra. And it's very much written in this sort of 1950s, 60s comic style that Swan was famous for. And he really did that in order to lure people in, to make them feel, yes, this is something we recognize, and then to whisk them away into something that's completely different. And people didn't like it. People after the first performance, they said, this doesn't fit, this misleads people. And so actually, after he licked his wounds, having had very mixed reviews after these first performances in Oxford, Cambridge, and London from British reviewers, he regrouped with Marsh, cut the thing down to 2 acts, and had it reperformed in the United States. And in the 2-act version, he cut the opening scene. The 2-act version in America was really well received, quite the opposite of the British reaction, but for the same reasons. So where the Brits had said, this is old-fashioned, this is eclectic, this is too melodic, the Americans all praised it for not being atonal and serial and trying to bombard you with whatever the newest avant-garde sound might be. But Swan, later on, when it became clear that no matter what the critics were saying, he would not be able to perform the piece because the copyright had been sold, he came to think that it was a mistake to have cut down the piece. And when he had his deathbed discussions with Leon Berger, who became the executor of his estate, and Jonathan Butcher, who became our conductor, Leon Berger was our Weston, he said, look, if you ever manage to put this back together, please put the opening scene back in. And so that's what we did.
Okay, because that's what, and I mean, I liked it just fine, but my whole thing's like, let's get to Perelandra, because it's kind of like, have you seen Otello by Verdi?
Sure.
Okay, well, it starts, boom, they're on the island, they're already trapped. So that's one thing you typically do in opera is if you have a story, you typically have to condense it. Now, at the same time, though, I mean, Verdi had probably one of like the 3 greatest librettists ever in Arrigo Boito, but I see that does make sense. That is interesting because I don't know how you, David, what did you think the first time you heard it? Because for me, I'm like, I want to go to Perelandra. Yes, this is all good, but I don't know if it's necessary. Not musically. Musically, I was fine with it. And I agree. And Judith is right on the money because at the time, tonal music was considered old-fashioned. It was passé. Interestingly enough, though, this did come out the same year as Terry Riley's In C, which changed everything for music. But David, I'm sorry, back to you. What do you think the first time you heard it? What do you think of the opening?
I just saw it as a contrast to what was to come.
Okay.
We've just been through Out of the Silent Planet on the podcast, and you want to emphasize the difference between Thulkandra and Malakandra. And I just saw the change in style as a comparison between Thulkandra and Perelandra, between Earth and Venus.
Okay.
Now, an overture was originally written, it's an instrumental work that precedes the opera, and basically is to get everybody, get in there, sit down, and be quiet because this is about to start. Now, what happened was, after a while, people just wanted to hear the overtures, which actually later led to the symphony. What's curious here is that the overture is so short. Judith, any comments on that? Or do you think maybe it's just because, hey, we've already spent quite a bit of time with these Daunish figures back on Fulcandra that let's get this thing going? Because I was surprised how short it was. Because when I listened to it without the titles, I couldn't tell this is the overture.
I think that's exactly right, John. I mean, we've already sat through a whole scene. We've already sat through the transition where Ransom comes and he has this beautiful song, How Shall I Describe Perelandra to You, which brings us musically into the world of Perelandra. And so now it's really just to sort of let the audience make that transition. Here we are. But it doesn't have to fulfill the function of everybody sitting down. It doesn't have to. He has so many melodies in this opera that he couldn't possibly fit them all into the overture, which is, also, of course, also one of the traditional functions of an overture. It introduces you to all the tunes that are to come. But there are so many, and they're so eclectic that actually it would have been a very difficult exercise, and one that shows just how eclectic the whole thing is, to try to put that all in the overture. So I think it's much more a transition. I'm not sure that we should really call it an overture, although that is what he titled it.
All right. And one thing I did want to mention, those long shorts, like bum, ba-dun, da-dun, long short, long short, long short. That's actually from the French school, and that was used for royalty. So anytime you hear that long short, long short, long short, I think it kind of, what do I say, foreshadows the king and the queen.
And that was, I'm really quite proud of myself because that's what I thought. I thought this sounds very regal, like almost like the trumpeters coming out to announce the coming of the king and the queen.
That's exactly it. And actually, the other place where you have an overture in this opera is not after the intermission, but at the beginning of the finale. So there's actually a piece called Finale Overture, which heralds the coming in of the king and the queen. And we have these rhythms again.
And there's one more thing I did want to say. It actually happens before this. I'd have to, for me, when I was listening to this opera for the first time, the fifth track, I think it's, let's see, Edward Weston, where the female voices come in and they say, this is Edward Weston, Earth Control. That is a total, I think, progenitor to Major Tom and David Bowie. And the fact that this guy, and the fact that this guy did it first, I was like, whoa! Which made me wonder if Mr. Bowie or Jones heard this, because I mean, he's very intelligent and he could like Life on Mars. Do you know what that's based on? Because you all know the song My Way by Sinatra. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Somehow he interpolated that and it became Life on Mars, which I think is just amazing.
Fascinating.
So but I just love that bit where and especially when you consider this all prefigures, or this is before space travel. I just find it really fascinating.
So many connections. It's wonderful.
Yes, so that's interesting. So I am not actually sure where that Edward Weston comes in the original score. Swan wrote quite a bit of music for Weston, and always atonal. As you've noticed, he's the villain. He gets the atonal music, and sort of this, 1950s sci-fi style. Flash Gordon, it's great. A lot of that was cut. And as I've said before, we reconstructed some of the cut material, but we didn't have the time and money to reconstruct all of it. So there's a number of things also with the dragon, the little pet dragon, and there's some more stuff with the spider. And there's quite a bit of stuff of Weston's. And so we left this one piece from Weston in as an example of what that style was like. But I think there was more of it, and I'm not entirely sure that it came at that point. So we performed that just before the overture. It's this sort of transitional piece. We have the two men on Earth waiting for Ransom coming, describing Perelandra to them, and then we cut away to Weston in his spaceship as he goes up to Perelandra to become the Unman. And then we have the overture. So we have this sort of lurking evil just before we come into these soaring regal sounds that we've just heard, foreshadowing that there will be trouble. So somebody, in fact, Leon Berger, the executor of Swan's estate, compiled a list of the main influences. And you can hear some of them here, but you can hear some of them later on. And I will just read them out. So we have the soupy Rachmaninoff and Tchaikovsky moments, the English pastoral tradition, Delius, in particular his A Village, the whoops and flips of Poulin, the spookiness of Britain's supernatural scenes, the bluesy lyricism of Bernstein, and above all, the Greek folk song, especially its elastic rhythms, often written in 5/4 and 7/8, with throbbing bouzouki or balalaika-like accompaniment. Add to this a few tongue-in-cheek B-movie soundtrack tremelandi and punctuations of horror, as well as a love of innocent revue song and knowing American musicals, and you get quite an unusual combination.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I would add in there, although this comes on later in the opera, I heard a lot of Ralph Vaughan Williams, because there's like one line that's taken. I don't know if he did it consciously or not, but there's a line that's taken straight out of I believe the third movement of the Dona Nobis Pacem by Ralph Vaughan Williams, a famous choral work.
Interesting. Yes, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah, and but that's fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah. Once we've had the overture, we move into some discussions between Ransom and the lady. And those are very lovely lyrical songs. The lady is obviously a soprano, doing her soprano thing. There are a good number of duets between them. Later on, a few trios when the king comes in, but he appears quite late in the opera. Although I must say, once he appears in the third act, I think that's actually where the best music is in many ways. And then Weston comes in, and then we get quite a lot of quite interesting music that I don't particularly like listening to. But that's probably where John comes in, because he can appreciate it where I can't.
Well, I assumed we weren't meant to like it particularly.
No, indeed, you're right. And there's a chorus that sort of functions like a Greek chorus commenting on the action. And that already starts with this Weston piece that comes just before the overture, and then carries on whenever there are key moments in the play, in the opera, when decisions have to be made, and they comment on the decisions musically. But I don't think we have any of those in our selections. Is that right? So we have No Man May Shorten the Way, and what's the other one? Birdsong?
Birdsong.
Oh yeah, so that's a really good example of the lady's style.
And Birdsong is what happens next in the opera from the three selections that we have.
That's right.
I love that so much.
Oh, so beautiful.
That is beautiful.
Just beautiful.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Leon Berger, but I mean, if the rights to that were ever put out, I know a lot of voice students who would perform that in recitals and
absolutely
and whatnot. There, I mean, it's gorgeous. I mean, So, but Judith, you have a closer connection to this than I do. What are your comments? And maybe I can piggyback.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this would be a beautiful recital piece. There are several of those actually, and I think it shows so clearly that Swan is not using the old-fashioned lyrical style naively or unthinkingly. He's using it because we are in a sense, a different and more archaic world than our own. And we're in a different and more archaic musical world than our own in his time. And he does it so beautifully. And in fact, if you'd like, I can read you just what the New Yorker in a 2.5 column review said about it, which fits very well to this piece. Nowadays, when every avant-garde composer's ambition seems to be to shatter his auditors' eardrums with the most original and progressive noise ever created, it is a pleasure to hear a work that is modestly written, merely to elicit an emotional response from an audience. Such a work is Swan's opera, Perelandra. It is a genuine opera with a very serious plot, and it is full of arias and choruses and has a deft score. It is unashamedly old-fashioned. It represents the Mendelssohn tradition, which is the tradition of most unself-conscious British music. A few dissonances appear from time to designate evil, but most of it is as innocent and sincere as Perelandra itself.
Wow, that was beautiful.
That's perfect. Well, that's perfect too. No, I agree. Yeah. And that's the thing. I think there's a huge political battle as to what music is now, but that's one of the things, because the emotional content of most atonal music I find to be a bit limited. I mean, I love it, don't get me wrong, but it is difficult to show that kind of innocence and beauty with like 12-tone music.
Mm. And just in the Birdsong, when I listen to it, it puts me in mind of the Green Lady and the animals just following her naturally, building up, because in this you have that little tweeting motif slowly build up as the piece goes on. It communicates an Edenic prelapsian world of harmony and unity. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I must say, I mean, we have to give a good deal of credit to Max Saunders, the orchestrator, who was Swan's regular orchestrator, but he really comes into his own here, transposing Swan's piano score to a 35-piece orchestra. I think it's exquisitely done.
And by the way, and the recording, I meant to say, Judith, is excellent. I mean, I was very happy because when David said, "Oh, there's an opera recording," I'm like, okay. And the first time I was like, "Ooh, this is nice." So, but you've got some wonderful musicians and singers. Well, of course, that includes the singers as well. But it is a wonderful performance. And I did have a question about that, but you answered it in the first half.
Thank you.
Or the orchestration there.
Thank you.
Okay, let's see. No Man May Shorten would be the next tune. And Judith, it seems like you have a little bit more insight to this than I do, because my observation is probably incorrect. So why don't you maybe talk about this first? Because you mentioned the Greek song earlier, which go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, Swan had Greek heritage, and he liked letting that flow into his music. It became a sort of signature of his otherwise very English music. But here, I think the dominant influence is the English boys' choir and choral tradition.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And we had it performed actually by one of the boys from one of Oxford's college choirs. And we had him perform it also in a chapel to just a single candle up in the pulpit, and it was absolutely transporting. The interesting thing about this piece is that it's not at all in the book. So this is the scene that I talked about earlier, where Marsh, the librettist, diverges most significantly from Lewis's story because Marsh was a pacifist. And so it was a real struggle for him to come to terms with the idea that Ransom had to fight Weston physically. And so we have this sequence of songs about Ransom's struggles with the idea that he has to fight Weston physically. And he does, and he kills him. And then he feels like Elijah after Mount Horeb and the prophets of Baal. He feels like he wants to die. He doesn't know what he has done. He doesn't know how to go on from there. And then this Maleldil, this angel, appears to him and says, "No man may shorten the way to Calvary." And it's this transporting moment in the opera, but entirely original to the opera as opposed to the book. And here it is.
No man may shorten burden seems too great for bleeding shoulders to uphold, too dark the path for failing eyes to see.
Oh, that is beautiful.
This-
And I have to say, I had a quick question. Does that young man have perfect pitch, or does he? Do you know?
Not quite.
Okay, because I have to say, he was pretty in tune when that piano kicked back in, and that's a dicey thing for
Yeah.
any singer, much less a child. So, like I said, the performance is wonderful.
Yes, so this was actually the song that Leon Berger played when he came to the C.S. Lewis Society and played us a few excerpts when he talked about this opera. And it was our own reaction to it that made us decide we had to put this thing on. And one of the people who was most influential in helping us realize that ambition, Jennifer Swift, who was a very long-standing member of the C.S. Lewis Society, died of cancer shortly thereafter. So we had the boy come and sing at her funeral that song, and it was beautiful.
Well, one thing I would say, I mean, I guess kind of closing remarks on the opera. I mean, it is wonderful. And I do think, and Judith had mentioned the canon earlier, or the opera canon, which, by the way, I mean, please, when we say canon, don't think that this is stayed. The canon is always open to adding more pieces. I think that's, but Judith, you'd probably back me up here. After you've seen opera for about 10, 15 years regularly, you've seen a lot of what you're going to see. I mean, nothing against Mozart and, Puccini and Verdi and Wagner, but they recycle a lot of the same stuff. But because I looked it up, and if you have something to add here, Judith, that'd be great. But I was looking through operas from the 1950s. The only one I can find from the 50s that's part of the canon would be Candide by Bernstein, which is an operetta and which actually got premiered on Broadway. Bernstein from West Side Story. And then after this, it would have to be 1976's Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass. And there aren't really any operas from the 60s other than the ones I mentioned prior, Barber's Antony and Cleopatra and Peter. Well, The Diary of a Mad King, I don't think would really qualify as an opera. But Judith, do you have anything to say about that? Because it sounds like you've heard a lot of it over the years.
No, I don't really. And I mean, Candide is such an interesting work because it's nearly a crossover to the musical, right? I mean, it's in the same crossover tradition as Sweeney Todd and almost Les Miserables, these through composed musicals that almost approximate opera. And no, I'm not historically trained enough to know what was happening in the 50s and 60s, why opera was just not a genre that composers naturally went to.
Well, there are a lot of operas composed. It's just not a lot have really stayed in the canon. Because from what I've looked at, like Menotti, like Amal and the Night Visitors, that was the first television opera.
Oh, that was wonderful, though.
Right. So that's, I mean, and there are some that have, but as far as ones that have like stayed in the canon, and by the way, just because it's not in the canon, it does not mean it's a bad opera. It just means we don't know it and it hasn't been performed enough. Because, like you said. And people always ask, like, do you write, symphonies and operas? And I don't, because they're expensive. I mean, and unless you're independently wealthy, you can hire out these, musicians for the time it takes to learn your music. It just costs too much money for most people.
Yes, absolutely. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, John, if you look at the sort of the canon of modern opera, do you think that there would be a place for Perelandra in it?
Oh, I think so. I would. I mean, I think there would be, because there was. Well, here's the thing. You've heard of Turandot by Puccini, right? Have you seen Turandot?
I have, actually, in a Roman amphitheater by the sea in Israel. It was remarkable.
Okay, well, I saw it here in Costa Mesa. All right. That's fantastic. Well, here's the thing, because that came out the same year as Wozzeck by Berg. Have you heard that?
Yes.
Okay. And the thing was, when Puccini died, he was very depressed because he was, like, again, old fuddy-duddy, has been. And when you looked at those two operas back in the time, I think that was like 36, 37, I believe. I could be off on those dates, though. Everybody would have said, between these two operas, Berg is the one that has a future, and no one's going to listen to Puccini again.
Wow.
And so the thing is, and the Berg opera is excellent, and Lulu is excellent. He is an incomplete opera, but the thing is, Wozzeck is an excellent opera, but and I'm sorry, Judith, you have seen it?
I've never seen it.
it?
See, I've only heard it. I've never seen that
Okay.
one. And I've had the opportunity to see it, and I have not taken the opportunity. And I think that's
okay.
dispositive of something, namely my ignorance of difficult opera.
Well, it's not. It's also depressing, though.
It's very depressing.
It is depressing as HELL. I'm talking like this. It's like the Requiem for a Dream of opera. I mean, and Lulu. I mean, Wozzeck is about a man that gets beaten down to nothing, and Lulu's about a woman that tears into everything and tears everything else into nothing. I mean, they're wonderful operas, but the music's difficult. Although I do like it, and I think it's more accessible than some of the other atonal stuff. As far as the canon, I think there's always room for more. And I think that is one nice thing is that they are, I mean, even like LA Opera, who has always been pretty risk averse, they are doing some different stuff now, like in their smaller Red Cat Theater over here on the West Coast. I know that Europe is much more experimental, and you get a lot cooler operas than we do. And a lot of operas by Glass and Adams, I know they get played over there first before they get played here, or they definitely get more performances over there. So that is one thing in which, like, the American opera going public can be a little bit limited because they all want to hear Puccini, they all want to hear Mozart, and think, hey, what about this new one by or this rediscovered one by C.S. Lewis? I do think there's room for it. If anything, you already have this baked in fan base with Lewis, or even if you tied into Narnia, hey, this is the guy that wrote Narnia. Some people I think would at least be interested because the nice thing about the fantasy sci-fi world is they're game to trying stuff that's different. And I don't know what your experience has been, either of you, but that's always been my feeling.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And actually, that's probably a good time to read you what Swan wrote about it. Just one sentence. In one of his late writings, he said, "I think of Perelandra with a great sense of yearning. There is a feeling of loss to be involved in such a huge drama and then find it not being performed all the time."
Oh.
Yeah,
Well,
because writing these things, I mean, it takes some time. How long did it take him to compose this? I'm guessing a couple of years.
A few years, yeah.
Yeah, and then he didn't orchestrate it, so that was handed off to somebody else. But still, it's a tremendous amount of work because, I mean, in my opinion, and I'd like to get both your perspectives. I do think opera is the highest form of art we can attain as humans, as far as the level of training that goes across everything. Because it's not just, it's the music and the musicians, but it's also the costuming and the staging and the special effects. And there's so much that goes into it, and so much of, like what even Wagner wanted to do, he couldn't do back in his day. Like, I haven't seen any of The Ring, unfortunately. I've seen Wagner, but not any of The Ring. But I think it's Gute Dämmerung, like the dragon shows up. And the big question is, okay, how bad is the dragon going to be? And so usually it could be a puppet, or it's like, a piece of cardboard. So like years ago, there was a chance, it fell through though. ILM was going to design a ring to be performed in LA.
Nice.
But it never happened.
I mean, it's so expensive. It's so ridiculously expensive.
Yeah, and that's the thing, because opera companies, friends, they do not make, they're lucky if they break even. Going into the black is like a blessing, so that's why you see all the benefactors in those programs.
It would actually be really interesting to see a big production company that does movies to do a movie adaptation of, some of these pieces in general. There's very often the conversion of regular musicals like Les Miserables to a movie. And so they get to have all of the deep pockets of those production companies to really pour into the sets. It would be very interesting to see something like an opera done in that fashion.
No, that's true. But on the other hand, I think so much of the experience of opera is being in the same space. And that goes all the way to sort of the sound, the manipulation of the air with the sound. Operatic voices, as I was saying before, are trained to sing without amplification in large opera houses. That kind of sound would not work well on film, where you don't need the projection, but the projection and the sort of being enveloped in it all is really what makes the experience. So I don't know how well it would work to translate the big operas onto screen without a major rethink of what kind of emotional impact they're meant to make, which is of course what they did with Les Miserables, where they aimed for very different emotional impact than the musical, where so much depends on seeing, that empty stage with that one person on it, solitary, in the middle of the dark. You can't do that sort of thing on film. And so you have these extreme close-ups, extreme sort of raw emotion.
Too close.
Too close.
I could
Absolutely.
count
Too
Hugh
close.
Jackman's nose hairs.
No, exactly. And you lose the sort of doubleness of the theater of the, extreme intimacy and the extreme formality, which really have to exist side by side. And that's so important in opera as well. I think that formality and intimacy kind of become one. And that's just not how movies work, not in the same way.
And I do agree, and she is correct. Operas do not come at you from 16 different speakers surrounding you. But at the same time, there are some excellent adaptations. In fact, David, well, actually both of you, but David, one of your countrymen, do you know Powell and Presser? The directors?
No.
The Red Shoes? Oh, okay. For the Death of Colonel Blimp, you don't know those films?
Nope.
Well, they did an excellent adaptation of The Tales of Hoffmann by Offenbach, which is really, really good. It is Martin Scorsese and George Romero's favorite film of all time. They both love it, yeah. But you could tell. But Judith is right, though. It's not the way you'd experience it in an opera house, but it is amazing in its own right. Also, I've seen both versions of it, and I do think The Death of Klinghoffer by John Adams is actually better as a film than as an opera. I think it works dramatically. It worked a little bit better for me there. But she's right. Because to just stick the camera on the stage and just let it record is a little bit different, because, as she mentioned, the in theater experience with live musicians, you can't replace it with the movie. But at the same time, there are good adaptations, but they are few and far between.
Well, we're nearing the end of our time, so how would you like to put a bow on this? Do you have any final thoughts about the opera in general, the music in particular?
David, I cannot thank you enough for sending me the CD. I thoroughly enjoyed it. The next thing I would really like to get is the score. So that's what I would just say. And I did want to say,
wow.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. Okay, yeah, she's shown me a handwritten score there. She's making me jealous. And I forgot to mention this last time, but I have composed a work. I have a chamber work for the Pilgrim's Regress, and I have put a tone poem for Out of the Silent Planet. So I need to get those kind of reassembled and out there. But it's wonderful. It's wonderful, beautiful music. And C.S. Lewis, like I said, does inspire quite a bit. And I'm still I haven't followed up on the Screwtape Letters oratorio yet, but it's on my to-do list. And what would you say, Judith? You probably have a cool quote from Swan there, or Berger. So what do you got?
I don't have any more quotes for you, but I do think that it is a marvelous piece of work. I think it has big melodies, beautiful choruses, beautiful recital pieces, and I would very much love to see it done properly. We had to fill in so much with narration that should be full of music, and nobody since 1964 has heard the full thing, and that's remarkable. I think we should try to have the whole thing reconstructed and performed.
I agree. I did have a quick question. Is the last piece of the opera? Because it's the king, because it's such a curious ending. Go your ways, my children, rather than farewell, ransom, which...
Yes, it is. It's the final piece of the opera, and it is very much a sort of coda denouement, leading people back into the ordinary world. Obviously, as we said before, Swan spends quite a bit of energy getting us to this world, taking us from where we are in England and bringing us there. And I think he gave a bit of thought to how to bring people back there and back again, as Tolkien would have said, into this world and back out of it. And so he has this very simple, quite short, quite prosaic dismissal by the king of all the animals, which in a sense is also a dismissal of us as the audience. So we have the beautiful, bittersweet, eschatological farewell ransom, with its sort of foreshadowing of the parting is the bitter rind of a fruit whose core is sweet. And when we meet again, that will be the sweet core of this fruit, whose bitter rind we are tasting now. But then, from that high point, he kind of sends us away with this very simple piece that ends the whole thing.
Professors Marr and Wolfe, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people go to find out more about you and send offers of help and money in bringing this opera back to the stage?
Okay. So, well, I can't. You funded this before, Judith. You go.
I've funded this before. In fact, as I said, T.S. Eliot partly funded it. His widows or his trust provided some of the money, as did Francis Warner, who is a poet and Lewis's last graduate student. But you can reach me. My email address is very easy to find on Google, and I am at my email address, so that's a very easy way of getting in touch with me.
No, okay, and I'm also, okay, and that's probably the best way to get a hold of me too. I'm at Santa Ana College, which is here in Southern California. If you just type my name in, John Marr, and Google that, you'll find me. And I'm sorry to say I have a very light social media presence. I don't have Instagram or TikTok or anything like that. So which is actually not very good for a composer or a musician, but I'd rather practice and write, so.
Understandable.
Yeah.
Well, thanks again to my two guests for coming on the show today, Professor Judith Wolfe and John Marr. And thanks to our audio engineer, Taylor Schroll, for editing this episode, which was recorded in 2 halves. And thanks to our listeners, patron supporters, and especially our top tier supporters, Matt 1, Matt 2, we are still waiting for Matt 3, Jake, Erica, Marvin, Joelle, Deborah, Amanda, Emmy, Thomas, Bill, Joanna, Bud, Shane, Kay, Paul, Kimberly, Gillis, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. We pray for all of our listeners every week on Tuesday, all the prayer requests in our Slack channel. And if you've enjoyed this episode, maybe see what operas are playing locally in your area. And join us next time,
When we'll continue to go further up
And further in.
cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.